Hello, friends of Studio Brule. This is Steve Brule, and it is coffee time. Time where I go over some of the stuff that's come across my desk over the last few days and since the last coffee break session. As you can see, I have my VIP club membership of the patriarchy at display here, which authorizes me to comment on the comings and goings of the evil feminist empire that has spread its thousands of tentacles all the way around the world. And today we have a very special guest, Warren Farrell. Warren needs virtually no introduction. I think everybody on my channel is quite familiar with Warren's work, at least some of it, especially The Myth of Male Power, and I think one of his more recent books, The Boy Crisis, which is getting some traction and is a very, very, very important topic today. Warren is probably one of the first people to sound alarms on important issues like this. He has a background of being elected 3 times to the National Organization of Women in New York, and Warren has a number of other books under his belt as well as numerous speaking engagements and an ongoing effort, I believe, and Warren can speak to this later, on the creation of a White House Council on Men and Boys. And today, with the election coming up next week, one of the most interesting political times in my life, possibly in the history of the U.S., whether Trump gets reelected or not. Trump being the antithesis of the feminist movement, basically. And with no further ado, I'm going to bring in Dr. Warren Farrell. Farrell, I always pronounce names wrong. Sorry for Warren in advance for that. Author, speaker, lecturer, and authority on men's issues, and quite an authority on feminism, I believe, as well. And Warren, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really good. I'm looking forward to our doing a good dialogue together.
Awesome. So you're in sunny California.
Yes, and it is sunny today, and we have had a lot of extra warmth called fires.
Fires, yes.
So we've we're all in very alert mood on a level that we would not like to be on, and we've had a number of power outages and stuff like that. So it's been a challenging time in California for sure.
God is punishing you for opposing Trump over there.
We are definitely a blue state.
And we're all going to suffer because there's bound to be a drought on good red wine coming out of California for a while, I think.
Yes, although there's a fair amount of places that have not been hurt. You know, the news always, the fires always make the news, but it is 4% of the state that's been affected, and so there is still 96% of the state that is has not been affected except by residual smoke.
Yeah. Well, maybe it'll give a little bit more smoky flavor to the wine. Sometimes that's
there. We go. Yes.
Wood flavor.
We'd have to use you for our marketing team.
Yeah. I hope the Napa Valley isn't too badly affected. That's pretty famous stuff there.
Yes, it is. No, it's the northeast part of Napa Valley that's been affected. One of my good friends is Barbara Nemko, who is the superintendent of schools of Napa County, and she said for the most part the populations in her schools have not been affected. So. Again, the news makes it sound a little bit worse than it is.
Yeah. So, Warren, let's get this out of the way here. You were in support of Hillary Clinton last time. That didn't go so well. Are you still Democrat, or are you swinging Republican?
I'm still a Democrat overall. However, the Democrats have been by far and away the worst when it comes to any understanding of feminism, any understanding of the shadow side of feminism, any understanding of boys' issues, any understanding of men's issues. And Biden, of course, has been the president or the vice president in the past, who has been extremely supportive, both as a vice president and before that, of the Violence Against Women Act. And the Violence Against Women Act is so rigid and so hurtful to women and men. I'll give you an example of that. I was at the White House talking to them briefing them on the boy crisis and what the issues were about. And with me there was the principal deputy assistant attorney general. And she had previously been in charge of domestic violence issues for health and human services in the United States. And so I asked her, I said, Kate Sullivan is her name. I said, Katie, it's really important that when there are shelters for domestic violence, that they be both women and men's shelters. First of all, it's sexism against women to force them to go to a shelter in the middle of a domestic violence situation and only have them be in shelters. Secondly, the shelters are teaching the women that anytime a man is violent, he will always be violent. And when the data shows us two things, one is that women in relationships are more likely to be the first ones to hit men than men are to hit women, and that at each escalation, that each of the 7 levels of conflict, women are more likely to be the ones to initiate hitting with an object, shooting somebody, stabbing somebody, hitting them, but usually it's at night when the man is sleeping or something along those lines, and they're still angry. And so, but what we know is that almost all domestic violence is a two-way street. That is, both women and men acknowledge hitting each other back and forth. And number two, the women themselves acknowledge being the first ones to hit more than the men acknowledge them being the first ones to hit. And to feminists' credit, there's now more than 150 studies showing this. A good percentage of those studies are done by feminists who set out to prove that the studies that came before them that showed this were wrong, and then they found out that they were right, and they couldn't go backtrack on that because while they considered women more credible than men, even the women were acknowledging that they were the first ones to do the hitting and the first one and the more likely ones to do the violence at each of the accelerated levels of violence. And so I talked to Katie about working with these shelters on teaching communication skills, because most violence occurs when people feel defensive as a result of feeling criticized, and the result of feeling criticized is that each person cuts each other off, interrupts each other, and the other person doesn't feel heard, and they try to clarify something, and then they get distorted, and then the clarification gets distorted again, and after it escalates and escalates, and then somebody loses it and hits the other one, and then that begins a whole process. And she said, I 100% agree with you, Warren. However, I have worked very hard when I was in charge of the entire United States programs for domestic violence that were created by largely with the great support of Joe Biden. And she said, the feminists are so entrenched in the bureaucracy of every single shelter that has been built in the United States, with one or two exceptions, that I, supposedly in charge, I could not break down the infrastructure of the anger toward men and substitute for that the communication skills programming, so both women and men could know how to change the behavior that led to violence. And the problem with that is that if that behavior is not changed, both the woman and the man will go out and be back in violent relationships again, because neither one of them are engaging in introspection over that issue. So when it comes to gender issues, Biden is, I'm afraid, as bad as he can be. However, I also do care about other things like global warming, about the COVID situation being averted, about a type of leadership that shows a type of masculinity that is not narcissistic, that is not bullying, and things like that. I want my sons and mothers to be able to say, I don't want boys in homes saying, Mom, I know you told me not to interrupt. Mom, I know you told me not to put people down. Mom, I told you not to lie. But the person who's president of the United States is bullying, is a liar, and is a narcissist, and is interrupting everything you tell me not to do. But he's our great leader. And so to me, that would really hurt boys in the long run. So in brief, I'm extremely pulled. I still come out in the Biden camp.
Oh, well, that's hard for me to hear.
Yeah.
Biden to me is just the next successor in silver-tongued, Teflon used car salesman. I don't believe a word that comes out of his mouth, and that to me is a non-starter. Uh, just too many lies, looking like a Gentile grandfather, but he's got all kinds of knives hidden behind his back there to use. I don't trust one thing. I guess the bottom line for me is that, fully admit that Trump is pretty rough around the edges at times. He's not refined. He's not slick. Uh, but he is getting results. He's got 4 peace deals in the Middle East, way more than the administrations before him combined. I guess I can tolerate a guy who's crude and coarse and unrefined if he's getting those kind of results in the world. And I know that if Biden comes out, he's going to strengthen VAWA, if anything. The Democrats have already said they're going to try and pack the courts to overrun the the Democrat hatred of Amy Barnett is inexcusable, yeah. Whether you're Christian or not. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but why? The woman seems to be impeccably credentialed. She has an impeccable career behind her. She is everything that the U.S. claims to stand up for, except that she's not a feminist and she's Christian. That's pretty scathing indictment of the perspective of the Democrats, don't you think?
The Democrats have a great deal of problems, and so do the Republicans. I really feel caught between a rock and a hard place in many respects. In the areas that and of course the areas that my life is about, like the boy crisis. Biden is the worst Democrat that I could hope for. But fear, I guess, would be more accurate than saying hope for. But let's get to gender issues in general, and and let the politics fall where they may. But I think it's really it's a very challenging time in the United States.
Definitely.
In time, for sure.
Well, those riots, okay, we want to shift off onto some gender issues, but it's hard to avoid the election. It's coming up next week, and there seems to be a lot in the balance. Mm-hmm. It's almost an election of an indictment of leftism in general. The U.S. is either going to swing far left in this election, or it's going to send a message that we're done with this push towards socialism and the feminist domination of things. Yeah,
I think a little differently than that. I think that if the part of what's created Trump is the movement is the identity politics of the left that has had no understanding whatsoever of the value of the father, that has sort of that has put all the emphasis on women's choice to be able to have children, to not have children, to raise children, not to have children or not have children, but to raise children by themselves, or to raise children with a father after divorce, to be able to be the ones to have the decision to be a full-time mother, and eliminate the father from the decision and marry a stepfather. And for the 14 years of research I did for the Boy Crisis book, when I first submitted the Boy Crisis book to the publisher, I had 10 clauses of the Boy Crisis that I said I was going to be researching, and I held them in my mind as somewhat equal clauses. As I started doing the research, I found that the fatherlessness was the hub issue, and everything else was secondary to fatherlessness. So, for example, if a male is born and is raised by a single mom, and he goes from a single mom family to a almost all female teacher school, that boy is, on the lottery game of things, he has a very high percentage chance of having major problems in school and not feeling constructive, having no postponed gratification, and having none of the discipline that's needed to succeed. the result is that that boy is likely to have significant problems in about 50 different developmental areas. However, if that boy grows up in a family with a mother and a father, and and goes to a school that has almost all female teachers, there's not as wonderful an outcome as if there are significant numbers of male teachers that can be role models for him, but it doesn't tend to destroy his life. That is, the impact of fatherlessness is far greater than the impact of female versus male teachers. And so I began to see over and over again each cause I looked at opioid overdose and addiction to video games, and all as contributors to the boy crisis. But when I looked more closely, the boys were less likely to be addicted to video games if they had a significant amount of father involvement. If they weren't what I call in the boy crisis book, if they weren't dad deprived, but that was the dad deprived boys who would oftentimes not have the postponed gratification and the discipline to be able to do things effectively in school, to get praise from teachers, praise from peers. And when it came to boy-girl time, they noticed that girls didn't want to date losers; they wanted to date winners. And so the boys turned to porn, and the porn addicted them to sort of increased amount of excitement with girls and women that made girls feel like they were treated like objects because they were being treated like objects. And so the girls withdrew, which then sent the boys back to more addiction to porn. Porn is basically access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection at a price he can afford. And so he is desperately trying to fear rejection, but then he's doing things that lead to the greater amount of rejection, which then just feeds a cycle. And that cycle taken in some cases, more the rare cases, is taken to severe depression. In fewer cases, but more drastic cases, suicide. And when I studied the mass shooters in the United States, especially the school shooters, they were almost all dad deprived, about at the 85 to 90% level. In the United States, since the year 2000, there's only been 5 school shooters that have killed more than 10 people, but every single one of them has been dad deprived.
Warren,
yes.
You've mentioned quite a lot of stuff there, and all of it is centered around father deprivation.
Yes,
these are boys without a meaningful influence of the father in their lives. Now, it's generally understood that the feminists and the Democratic Party, in my mind, is really better identified as the feminist party of the U.S. now. They're almost entirely controlled by feminism. And it's we need more fatherhood in the family. The Democrats are going in the opposite direction. I know I'm going to challenge you a little bit here, but what keeps you connected to the Democratic Party instead of saying, like, these are, if you agree with what I just said, we'd have to conclude that it's the Democratic Party that are pushing and creating these problems that you would like addressed. But you still believe yourself to be a Democrat.
As I said, I believe myself to be caught between a rock and a hard place.
Right. Yes. It's a difficult time for traditional liberals, classical liberals.
For me, the narcissism of President Trump is not the role model that I want our sons to have. The way he behaved in the first debate is exactly the opposite of everything I want for a male to be. And at the same time, the Democrats, and especially Joe Biden, has been the one that has, violence against women. That should be a domestic violence act, not a violence against women act.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Number 2, it should be focusing on teaching people how to communicate effectively. As not to prove your point on these issues. I've been conducting couples communication workshops around the country for the last 30 years. And one of the reasons I conduct those workshops is that I find that I don't want to legislate that people have to be married. So rather than have legislation for marriage, I'd rather have communication to have good marriages and quality marriages, not marriages people have to be forced into having once they make that decision. And so, and I discovered that almost all communication breaks down when a person feels criticized by their partner. And most people feel criticized by their partner, even if their partner makes a well-intended, constructive suggestion to change some type of attitude or behavior that they're doing for the purpose of the betterment of that person, the betterment of the couple, and so on. Nevertheless, when they have a suggestion made, they often feel defensive about it. And instead of saying thank you for improving our ability to work together effectively, they feel like they're put down, or they feel like a child. They feel infantilized. They feel like not valued, and they respond defensively to that. And that creates a sort of fear on the part of both men and women that there will be any that why bring something up, because it's only going to cause problems. So both men and women tend to keep their feelings to themselves and feel unheard and unseen. And so the person they're supposedly closest to, in some ways that they feel farthest away from, that ends up either leading to a divorce in legal terms, or the man or woman goes off and has an affair, or they have affairs of other things. They could become so deeply involved in the church they neglect their family, so deeply involved in their work they neglect the family, or they start drinking or doing drugs and so on. And so to take to illustrate your point here, to take the what should have been called the Domestic Violence Act, and to turn domestic violence into a women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors, is to me is using the enormous amount of billions of dollars that is put into the Violence Against Women Act and making it anti-woman and anti-male, but especially anti-male, because the great majority of people around the world believe that when they hear domestic violence, they think man perpetrator, female oppressed. It is also true, to illustrate your point, that when I was in the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, there was a great deal of interest in Lenin's critique of the family, and believing that the family is a patriarchal system that oppresses women and benefits men. And that is really a complete misunderstanding of the family, where basically both sexes gave up doing what they really might have wanted to do, and became had rigid roles that were designed to benefit their children and not themselves. And women's roles was raise children, men's roles was raise money, or some combination of both, whether money was killing for food or whatever. It was the equivalent of doing that. Men did make the rules outside the home, but women made the rules inside the home. Both sexes made rules in the area of their responsibilities. They had more. Men were not often allowed even into the place where children were born. They had to stay out. And as the Catholic Church has often said, give me a child for the first 5 years, and I will give you the man. I will give you the adult woman. And certainly the women had the children of those first 5 years and had a great deal of influence on them. And so what we need to do is something that I can't get either party to do. You mentioned, Steve, at the beginning that I was chairing the coalition to create a White House Council on Boys and Men. And I've always been adamant that White House Council effort be bipartisan. So I went out and I interviewed 9 of the Democratic candidates for president in Iowa. 7 of those interviews are on my YouTube channel. And trying to get and persuade the Democrats to understand the value of family, the value of fathers. And I did have a significant impact with 2 of them, John Hickenlooper, who then dropped out of the race, but is probably, possibly the next senator from Colorado. And Andrew Yang did bring up the boy crisis in very briefly for 1 sentence or so in one of the debates. And then I went to the White House and tried to do the same thing with the White House. Unfortunately, I was invited to the White House. I wasn't invited to interview the Democratic candidates. Another example of how the Democrats are much more resistant to understanding the value of fathers, and the Democrats are much more resistant in their ability to understand the value of the family as well. They really missed that point. So part of, I guess, what I see as part of my mission is to get the Democrats to make some dent in that process. But I do totally acknowledge that the Republicans have been, at least in my experience, much more immediately understanding of the value of the family and the value of fathers, and there I am aligned with the Republicans.
So, you mentioned that your objection to, that's a lot of material to keep there, so I can't I can't respond to all of that, but it's great that you're doing this work, and I 100% agree with it. I got a couple of comments to make. One is that if Trump, your rejection of the Republicans is on the basis of you feel that Trump is not a good role model for boys in general. Do you then think that Biden is a better role model?
I think if you look at the first debate between Biden and Trump, before Trump got all of his negative feedback and revised himself in the second debate, I think you see the essential characters there. And that was and so the constant interruption, bullying, belittling, lying, the fact checkers who tend to be more liberal than conservative, but nevertheless, about a 10-to-1 ratio of just things that weren't accurate. So I don't want I would much rather have young boys today see the type of personality issues aside for a moment, the personality that Biden has, which is one of, he's always been somebody to go across the aisle, make friends, not demonize the other gender. The United States, as I'm sure you would agree, has been very, very divided in the last 4 years, and that has definitely been, in my opinion, blown up by Trump. Second, the way he has handled the COVID. If I had to create a disaster scene in a science fiction movie for a president handling the COVID situation badly, I would basically do the same thing that Trump. I would create the experience, the leadership that Trump did, which is not leadership, but it is really terrible, and we're paying the price for it. And ironically, now the North Midwest countries are paying the price. And third,
if I can interject on that just a little bit.
Yeah, just one more thing, and that's
sure.
Yeah, and then the other thing, to answer your question more fully, is I really do feel that global warming has a very strong human input, and that we need to, and I know a great deal about some of the things that we can do to prevent that. And I think Biden is very much on track on that issue, and I couldn't disagree more with Trump on that issue. And I think those two things. COVID is the survival of human beings, and survival is the key issue, and the other is the survival of the planet. And so, on the two survival issues that are most important, even though I devote my life to gender issues, where I agree with the Republicans more than the Democrats, in those two huge areas, I am as opposed to Trump as I could be.
Okay. Well, you're going to be opposed to me as well, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
That's okay. I'm not saying that we can't be friends. I hope to have our conversations for the rest of our lives. Because you do have an enormous amount of respect for a lot of the work, all of the work you do publicly is respect to gender issues and boys. And I've quoted you many times on my live streams and videos and stuff. So it's not coming from that point of view. But I do want to throw this out there. Both of the two issues you mentioned, global warming and COVID-19, these are presented to us by the left as survival issues, specifically to drive up fear so that we obey we conform to their suggested solutions. And their suggested solutions are worse than the disease. Their cures are worse than the disease by a long shot. Every analysis of the responses to to global warming would send huge portions of the world into starvation. And the COVID-19 thing, let me give you an example here. Well, you're familiar, the CDC just 6 or 8 weeks ago came out and said that 96% of the cases of deaths due to COVID-19 were in fact comorbidities. In other words, the person died of the disease, they didn't died with the disease, not of the disease, which leaves 4% of the reported cases. And this is because the CDC instructed all hospitals to register everything that they could as COVID-19, and they gave a financial incentive for doing it. So they drove these statistics up. I'm going to just mention one more thing on the COVID-19. Just last week, the New York Times, or a couple days ago, the New York Times came out with this alarming headline, 500,000 new cases of COVID-19, blaming it on Trump, several days before the election. And this, to me, is pure election hysteria, trying to divert from the successes of the 4 peace deals and the other, I forget which other thing I was going to mention there. But it's a distraction. It's a distraction to try and swing, late stage distractions, swing this debate around. These 500,000 new cases are highly questionable, Warren. The survival rate from COVID-19 is huge. The death rate is tiny. In fact, there's been the statistics showing year-to-year overall death rates in the U.S. have shown that 2020 is exactly in line with every other year for the last 5 or 8 years. So both of these issues, to me, they ring like fear-mongering in order to get a compliant public to go along with plans with an ulterior motive. So you can see how far you and I are apart on these two issues. I don't think we are anywhere near, not even remotely near, a survival issue on either of those issues. So we are more likely to be, our survival issue should be worried about a giant asteroid from outer space hitting the Earth, because that would be a real survival issue, you know?
If that happened, I'd put up my hand to stop that asteroid.
Yeah. Yay! I command you to retreat.
Yes.
Okay. How about this? Okay, I'm going to get back to some of the other stuff that you were mentioning. I have my little spiel there.
Sure.
A lot of your work, and I understand it, this is your work, is relationship-related work. It's everything in your work seems to be related on getting people to listen to each other, to be honest to each other, to put the issues on the table and try to resolve them so that we can have a better life. And I'm 100% on board with that. 100%.
Yes. And that's why we're a good model, disagreeing on issues, but hopefully hearing each other.
Right. And I do draw a distinction between a leader and a private relationships, because the leader Trump has, the leader of the U.S. has a difficult job. He has to be a son of a bitch sometimes in that job. And a lot of the previous leaders, they've tended to be very smooth talkers. But you can bet behind closed doors they are every bit as son of a bitch as Trump is in public and more. So I'm not so sure I really care about Trump's public persona very much. I just don't care. But because I can explain to my son and my family, you know, the errors of that form of communication in your private life for most of us. But here's an idea that came up to me while you were speaking there. Paternalistically, or as a father's role in the family, I think I've come to understand that is to set boundaries. A male typical role has been to set boundaries. In other words, setting boundaries often, especially for children, is saying no. The ability to say no, mean no, and follow through with that no. Now, to put this to where we're at today, it's almost no one with public power has said no to feminism as a general for 60 years. It's just yes, 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 and the feminists believe that everything they conceive of is valid and must move forward, or else they're oppressed. And the Democratic Party has taken that on, and we see that with the Squad, and we see that with their response to Antifa. They're encouraging Antifa. We see that with their response to Amy Garnett. They literally want to tear down the Supreme Court because they didn't get their way. They're like children having a temper tantrum when they're told no, because they're not accustomed to be told no, and to not getting their way. And this is an enormously huge warning flag, red flag for the entire Democratic Party when they say we're going to have an impeachment again, we're going to impeach Amy Garnett. You know, this is childhood temper tantrum stuff going on. So I threw a lot about at you, so you can decide whatever you want to respond to in that.
Well, a book I wrote was called "Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say," and basically in that book I'm saying exactly what you're saying around that issue, which is that we men have to speak up, and we have to say what is not accurate out there.
I just want to interject just for 1 second.
Sure.
Because a lot of speaking up, there's a lot of men. I've been in this situation many times. We're told to shut up. We're told to shut up and listen. And if we speak up, we're ridiculed. What about men just speaking up with one word and say, no, it stops here?
Well, I would say speaking up requires more than no. No sounds authoritarian and without reason, and it doesn't give women credit or people credit for having the possibility of understanding why no.
But a lot of that conversation goes on forever, Warren. Like, you have that conversation. Doesn't there come a point when the other side is just not really listening? Feminists don't listen very much. Do you know that? You know that.
I think there's probably no one that knows that better than I do.
Yeah.
But there's
At what point do you just say no?
Yeah. But
does there come a point? There come a point?
Well, there comes that point, and MGTOW, men going their own way, and incels have said no. But it's important. Men and women. We're all in the same family boat, and when only one sex wins, we both lose. And we have the issue is communicating with each other, and yes, we don't have here's what happens when we do open our mouths. When I was on the board of NOW, every single thing I wrote for the New York Times was published. The first thing I wrote for the New York Times was supposed to be 700 words. I wrote 1,400 words. So what do they do with my 1,400 word op-ed? They normally send it back and say, too long, sorry, get out of here. And they took my 1,400 word op-ed and they made it into 2 op-eds because I was supporting the feminist cause and saying what they wanted to hear. Then I wrote another op-ed that say it was published, etc. And then I started to talk about boys' issues and men's issues, especially men's issues. And the next 28 op-eds I submitted were rejected. So I have a very, I went from earning, doing 50 speaking engagements a year around the country to doing 0 once I started speaking up. And so the cost of my speaking up has been more than a $10 million based on a conservative analysis of what I could have made if I had stayed only with the feminist perspective. And so I certainly see how the point here is that I really understand how challenging it is to speak up. I also understand that it was part of my privilege that I could speak up because I didn't have children and I had a wife that was earning a significant amount of money, decent amount of money. And then I was single for a while without children, and then I remarried. And the woman I married we have children, but she had a decent earnings to help me be able to have an opportunity to be able to speak up without paying a price of living in a shack or not having hot and cold running water and so on. So I've been able to have a decent life and be able to speak up. Many men, many people, but mostly men who would speak up have to worry about their jobs. So for example, today, a couple of days ago, I did a show on CNN on the boy crisis. And it was to be aired in this November, by Lisa Ling on That's Life. And she wrote me and said, sorry, Warren, we're going to have to take you out of the show because you're aligned with too many people in the men's movement And recently Royden Hollander was a murderer. He was associated with the men's movement, and we're afraid to undermine the boy crisis because she's very feminist, and the show is very feminist because we might get too much negative feedback about that. We don't want to hurt the show. We don't want to hurt the issue of the boy crisis. And so we had a back and forth on that issue. Long story short, that's the way it's going to be. But these are just the latest, and our last communication was today, the latest example of just dozens and dozens of examples in my life of where I totally empathize with the price one has to pay for speaking up about boys and men's issues. And the reason for this, as I see it, is that historically speaking, the role of us as men was to be willing to think of ourselves as more men if we were willing to be disposable in every generation's war. And so what we have allowed ourselves to be is to be valued for our willingness to die so women can live. It is the ultimate example of female privilege. The person dying is not the privileged sex. The person willing to die and programmed to die is obviously the sex that is the servant sex, the sex that is the disposable sex. And what we have allowed feminism to do is to say that sex that is willing and programmed to die and disconnect from their feelings so that they would be willing to die are the privileged sex, that they are in charge of the patriarchy, and the patriarchy's desire is to make rules to benefit men at the expense of women. And that could not be farther from the truth. And so what I'm hoping that I'm able to do in my life is to confront that belief. Yes, there is white privilege, but there is not there, and there is male privilege and there's female privilege. And there's a price that men pay for their masculinity and a price that females pay for exaggerated femininity. But what feminism has done is it has freed women to have many choices, and instead of saying men should also be freed to have many choices, which is what Betty Friedan believed and wrote that in The Second Sex, that has not come out as the primary message about feminism. The primary message has been women are oppressed and men are the oppressors, and that is a message that could not be farther from the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% on board with you on that one. I did a video on the birth of feminism, starting from Roman times through to 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention.
Yes.
And in the researching of that, I was actually astounded at just how deceitful feminists were in founding the feminist movement. In fact, in 1840, the woman who organized the Seneca Falls Convention, she attended a abolitionist convention and was not permitted to sit in the privileged seating area, which annoyed her and which sparked her to create her own convention with her as the star. And that's why the Seneca Falls Feminist Convention came to be. But what was really interesting is that in the Declaration of Sentiments in the original founding feminist convention, they lifted all of the oppression narrative exactly from the institution of slavery, and they dropped it square onto the story of women being treated by men. The oppression story of slavery is, in fact, through all humanity, through all peoples. And it is a history. It's a terrible history of oppression. But the history of women is not, by even a long shot. It's a history of privilege and protection by men. So that is the enormous lie of feminism that is still perpetuated today, that men oppress women throughout all of history.
Yes.
So I have absolutely no desire to concede any of this feminist crap to them. As far as I'm concerned, we need a women's movement in the world, but they need to abandon feminism and start from scratch, because feminism cannot be cleaned up. It cannot be cleaned up.
Well, I think
I state that strongly, but
it will be extremely hard to reverse for sure. And so what I saw at the beginning of feminism was a very different step forward than what has happened. And so I think feminism has gone, if I were to be very brief about it, from I am, Helen Reddy's "I am woman, I am strong" to "I am woman, I've been wronged." And
Yeah.
and I used to be on, a number of shows in the early parts of feminism when I was on the board of Now, and this was 1970 to 1973, 74, and 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 it was one of the shows that was on was a show called The David Susskind Show, and they would often invite some of these male chauvinist types on the show, and the male chauvinists would say, you watch it. Women in the workplace, they're going to be saying, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. Don't they're going to act really fragile. They're going to be and men just sort of putting each other down, which men do as a sign of respect to each other, and it's part of their rite of passage. When you put down a woman, she's gonna sort of really respond very negatively and walk away and get upset and get emotional for days. Well, that's not only been true, but what the male chauvinists were predicting, I'm afraid, has not only become somewhat true, but it's become institutionalized. She would be more likely to report what happened that she was offended by to human resources, and human resources is no longer HR; it's become HER. It's mostly, almost completely, about her issues, and so the result of that is that our men, the male executives who are, Cynthia Epstein, showed in the progression of women, the women who were progressing the most at work were the ones that were mentored by men. Even when there were women in equivalent positions to mentor them, the men were more willing to mentor the women than the women were to mentor the women. And so, but today, the 30 or 40 male executives that I've talked to since the hashtag Me Too have said, I'm just afraid to mentor a woman. I have a wife, I have children. My career could be ruined if I meet with her behind closed doors. I'm under suspicion. If I leave the door open, I'm under suspicion. Something could be overheard and taken out of context. If I take the woman out at night to dinner and we pay for it for business expenses, I could be accused of trying to date her. And so instead of men saying, I really want to mentor women more, men are saying, no way, shape, or form am I going to mentor these women because I have everything to lose and nothing to gain. And this is exactly the opposite. This is what male chauvinists were saying. And the people I was debating were saying these things. And we've institutionalized through HR departments this type of infantilization of women. This does not show respect for women. We show respect for women when we hold them as accountable as men. When we say, I'm going to speak up and I will fight and sue when you fire me for speaking up. So these are the types of things that the best people in the men's issues movements are doing, but that's different from the original intent of at least many human beings who became feminists. While there was, while feminists were misled, and we were all misled by the sequence that you just put your fingers on, Steve, which was the sequence from we had in the slavery camp or the civil rights movement. We did have legitimate oppressors and legitimate oppressed people, and then we moved to Marxism, where there was a theory of oppressors in the ruling class and oppressed in the working class. And we took that hierarchical oppressor-oppressed dichotomy and we moved that over to men. And we said, well, men do earn more money than women, not for the same work, but we said it was for the same work. We lied about that. And we said, and then said, therefore, because men earn more money, they must be the oppressors and women the oppressed, as opposed to understanding that the road to high pay is a toll road. The more money you make, usually the most fulfilling occupation, being a musician, being a starving artist, they are called starving artists for a reason. The more fulfilling the occupation is, the less it pays. And so many dads had a dream of becoming a writer, an artist, a musician, or an elementary school teacher. And then when their second or third child was born, they had to give up those dreams of fulfillment and trade it in for selling product X or Y that they didn't believe in, and then selling it on a national level and being away. They learned the father's catch-22 to earn love by being away from the love the love, selling product X in another state somewhere else and being away overnight. And then they earned more money as a result of making those sacrifices. And then we feminists turned around and said, you're earning more money, you must be more privileged, as opposed to saying, thank you for earning money. So you gave us the privilege of loving and being loved while you went off to war and were killed or learned how to kill and be killed.
And this comes down to the fraud of feminism. They will always be this way. It's a mindset that starts with you oppress us, therefore we're going to destroy you. That's feminism in a nutshell, Warren. Like, I have no interest in seeing them pretending to redeem themselves. I'm quite fed up with it. But let me ask you another thing here. We were talking about the negotiation aspect of human relations, of course, which is, again, your forte, your life's work. But at what point do you face the fact that the other side is not interested in a good relationship? That the other side really is in a gish gallop of throwing up endless issues, even issues they know are lying. They're all of that just to maintain control of the narrative and take advantage. At what point do you just say, you know something, we're never going to get together on this, we have to end it. And just to throw this out, this one last point on that same line. I've had relationships with women in the past where it would, I'm not going to get into too details, but when there was just absolutely no going forward, no matter how you listened, no how much you conceded. But the only thing that brought the person back to the table was saying, okay, if that's the case, we have to end this. And it's at that point that suddenly the other party says, well, maybe I don't want this to end. Maybe I am being unreasonable. The power of that word, that deadline, that end point, the reality that you're not going to tolerate this whatever infinite stuff for an infinite amount of time. Because like spoiled children, if they keep getting their way by screaming and throwing temper tantrums, they're going to keep screaming and throwing temper tantrums until there's a hard end point. Can you speak to that, to the degree that we're not getting anywhere negotiating with feminists and the Democratic Party?
Yeah, you don't really. People who are ideologues, for the most part, are people who are programmed to not listen. They're programmed for confirmation bias to be able to find data that proves what they feel. And there's probably some deep personality things that separate the type of person who's attracted to being more liberal than conservative. But there certainly is value to sort of saying something to the boundary enforcement issue. And that is something, interestingly, that is a very big difference between typical dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting. Let me actually spend a minute on that, if I may, because this will probably be more useful for people. One of the reasons that children grow up so much more productively in families with both moms and dads is that moms have more of a potential, a propensity for protecting and nurturing, and dads have more of a potential propensity for boundary enforcement. So the big misunderstanding here is the differences between boundary setting and boundary enforcement. Both moms and dads are pretty good at setting boundaries. Actually, moms set more boundaries than dads do. Moms and dads are, but they're both likely to say some version of, sweetie, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. And the kids, of course, will do the exact same thing with both mom and dad at the beginning, which is they'll try to have as few peas as possible and before they get their ice cream. And the difference between moms and dads on average, and sometimes this is reversed, the difference between moms and dads on average is that when the child is pressing to have as few peas as possible, Moms are much more likely to have empathy prevail and say, okay, sweetie, we're divorced. I know you miss your dad. I'll tell you what, you can have a few less peas and then you can have your ice cream. Or I know you had a bad day in school. That bully was there, or you got a bad grade in school. I'm so sorry about that. And instead of saying in her mind's eye, bad grade means poor postponed gratification. You need more discipline. I'm going to have you finish your piece. That's part of the discipline. Her empathy prevails over that the second type of mentality. And she goes, okay, sweetie, I'll tell you what, have these 20 more peas, let's say, and then you can have your ice cream. So she's given in. And now the kid knows that he can manipulate a better deal. So he has 10 peas rather than the 20 peas. And mom says, I'm not going to get into a big fight over a few peas. So, okay, sweetie, go ahead and have your ice cream now. At least you tried. Whereas dad is much more likely, on average, to say, excuse me, we have a deal here. And the deal is that you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. Oh, Dad, you are so mean. Mom doesn't do that to me. I had a bad day in school. Why are you doing this to me? You're just making it worse. Well, you can continue whining and complaining like that. Then there'll also be no more ice cream. There'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. Uh-oh. If things are getting worse as a result of my complaining and whining, I'd better focus on doing what I need to do. And here's the important takeaway from this. I'd better focus on doing what I need to do, finish the peas, in order to get what I want to have, the ice cream. And so the data on this is that children raised predominantly by men, only 15% of them are likely, boys especially, are likely to be ADHD, whereas children raised predominantly by moms, 30% are likely to be ADHD. And if you look at that example, you can see how with the mom, the child did not learn to have to focus his or her attention on what needed to be done, finishing the peas. She or he could have attention deficit, focus on what she or he wanted, and then end up getting it by doing manipulation.
Manipulative. Yeah.
Whereas with the dad, the child is more likely, on average, to learn that I have no option but to put my attention not as deficit, but as focused on finishing those peas before I get my ice cream. I'm only going to win if I finish those peas, and then I'll get what I want. So the child with the dad is more likely to learn postponed gratification. Postponed gratification is the biggest predictor of success or failure in life. And so the child goes to school, the one that has the ADHD gets interrupted by a text that comes in and an invitation to play a video game, and she or he has a goal of doing well in school, or a goal of focusing on rehearsing for the play, or practicing for the varsity team. And what happens? They don't fulfill that dream. And when they don't fulfill that dream, after a while, all the mother love of, sweetie, you're really good at singing or music or whatever, should go and do it. So the child does it, but they don't have the discipline to fulfill what the dream is. And then they start, after a while, becoming afraid to dream. And that's more likely to happen with boys, who then, with the fear of dreaming, because boys not only have the fear of dreaming and failing, but they can't talk to other boys about how I failed and how I feel. And so they start keeping their feelings all inside of themselves. And then they become addicted to drugs, addicted to drinking, addicted to video games, or, like I was saying before, addicted to porn. And so your whole larger point about the importance of men needing to know. So men don't say these things, by the way, to women. They don't say, sometimes they do, but oftentimes they don't say, here is the outcome of enforcing boundaries versus just setting them. When you set boundaries and you don't follow through with it and enforce it, the child has a disrespect for you. The child feels it can argue with you, it can be coercive toward you, and so on. And these are things that undermine your ability to be effective. And the dad is far more likely to roughhouse with the child or to play with the child, and that the playing creates a bond. The bond creates leverage that the father can use to enforce the boundaries without alienating the child or creating rebellion. So
great point. Yeah.
These are all the types of things I say in the Boy Crisis book. This is just 1 out of 9 differences between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting that I outline in the Boy Crisis book. And so for me, one of the things I want to do in the world in my short period of time left is to be able to say, dads, here's, normally speaking, you would not say to your mom, I want a roughhouse in order to make my children more empathetic. But in fact, the roughhousing in the way that dads tend to do it does lead to a greater amount of empathy, does lead to a greater amount of ability to distinguish between being assertive and aggressive, does lead to postponed gratification. And so you need to be able to share these with mom, because moms can't hear what dads don't say. And so for me, my time in this world, I'm trying to do the best so that both sexes can be heard. And for the last 50 years, we've always had a battle of the sexes. But for the last half century, and I know that you would agree with this, we've had not a battle of the sexes, but we've had a war in which only one side has shown up. And men have put their heads in the sand and hoped the bullets would miss. And it's time for men to get out of the heads out of the sand. And what's going to happen?
Some of us are taking some shots.
Yeah.
Like you know very well, don't you?
and I guarantee you will take some shots.
If I could share a story with you, just on exactly it fits in with what you were talking about here. My son's mother and I split up when he was just under 3 years old, and she used to complain about how hard he was to control and how bad behavior he was. And this was after I straightened that out at our place. I read a parenting book talking about exactly what you've been talking about. I read it years before, maybe a decade before I had my son, and the ideas never left my mind because they made so much common sense about boundary setting, like you're saying. And I remember once, once, the first time after our separation, I think, or early on after our separation, when I had to go and get groceries with my son. And he was 3 years old. And so we were in the grocery, before we go into the grocery store, I said that he could pick one treat that he wanted while we were, one treat. And I made it very clear to him that he could pick one treat. And we got to grocery shopping, and he started to see all these things he wanted, and he started to grab at them and said, screaming, and like he wanted this and he wanted that. I said, you can pick one. And I had two of ones in my hands of what he had wanted. I said, you can pick one or the other. And he screamed again, he wants them both and he wants more. I said, this is your last chance. One or none.
Wow.
One or none.
Yes.
I think I might have said that twice to him. And when he wouldn't give up, I left the grocery cart there. I took him out of the grocery cart in my hand, screaming all the way to the car. I said to him at the time, if you're going to keep this up, we're going home, and that's it for the day. We went home with no groceries. And you know something? He was the best behaved kid for the rest of his upbringing. That one incident, that one day of sacrifice, we had few things in the house. We had some stuff to eat, but it wasn't great. He never acted up again like that. Never again. And he was 3 years old. I'll give you one more example. He was learning to ride a bike. I think he was 4 or 4.5. Or something like that. And so I had a big old house in downtown Brockville. And inside the house, it was like, it had this big hallway, and you can go around in a circle through the dining room and living room. And so it was winter when I gave him his bike for Christmas. And it had like training wheels on it. So I let him ride around inside the house, right? And come spring, he has to learn to ride without training wheels. So we go outside, and I take him to the park, and he learns to ride without training wheels. And the next time I said, okay, we're going to go for a walk, but through town, and I explained to him that you've got to stay on the sidewalk, and if I say stop, you have to stop and wait for me. No second chances. And if you come to a road, you have to stop and wait for me. And so I made sure he understood all this. And I said, if you can't, then we're going home, and that's it for the day. No more biking today. So we got out, it went okay for a little while, then he decided to push the boundaries. I corrected him on that, I reminded him, and then the next time he was going to go down this road, and I said, stop. He didn't stop. So I ran to him, I told you have to listen. What is the punishment? He says, we have to go home. So I said, yes, we do. And I picked him up in one hand and the bike in the other hand. This time he's not screaming at me. He's just trying to negotiate. He's trying to say, but I'll be good. But I'll be good. I said, no, you understand it's dangerous. I explained to him it's dangerous. You can't have you running off without me. We went home, put the bike away for the day. And again, I never had another problem with that for the entire rest of my life. He was the easiest to control child that I ever seen. And people, when we went up in public, would always comment on how well behaved he is. So this is just to confirm into what you're saying there. It absolutely works, and I think it works every single time. But here's the thing. I'm on a little bit of a roll here. The one thing that I always remembered about that book that I read, and I don't remember what the book was, but the author insisted that you think for a minute and plan ahead, and never put a punishment out that's harder on you than it is on the child, because the child will win.
And never put a punishment out that you cannot fulfill. And so you don't put the punishment out of anger. You put the punishment out, like you were saying. It's very important. We just said there that you said there will be no more bicycle riding today. You didn't say forever. You didn't say for a week. You didn't say for a month. Because the moment you overstate the punishment, then you start feeling guilty. And with many moms, they will they'll warn, and then they'll repeat it again, and they'll repeat it again, and they'll repeat it again, and they get very frustrated that they're putting all this time, love, and energy into the child, and they have to repeat. And then finally the child disobeys, and the mother gets furious about and feels a lack of respect and contempt from the child to her. And so she, in the fury, creates a punishment that she can't execute on, or she doesn't want to execute on when she's no longer so furious. And so then she goes back and apologizes for the punishment, and the child has her in his or her hand.
Excellent point. And I just want to throw one other thing for any parents out there right now. That another thing I remember from that book that is very important is that often a child will be acting up when you're out, and you can't figure out like what to say about it, what punishment to put. You don't want to kind of overstep it, like you're saying, Warren. Mm-hmm. This author suggested that you say this, okay, and this worked for me very well, actually. You say, you're being bad. I told you couldn't do this. I'm going to think about what your punishment will be, and when we get home, we'll talk about it. And the interesting thing about this is it gives you all this time to figure out what is a good level of punishment. How can I follow through on it and have it all planned out by the time you get home?
Yes.
So that it's something that, and she emphasized again, it was a female author, she emphasized again that make sure at every single time that the punishment is harder for the child to live with than for you to live with.
Yes.
You're not trying to punish yourself.
Yeah.
But those little tricks really work brilliantly.
It is. And these are little things that, it's one of the reasons why children raised with not just mothers and fathers, but what I call in the Boy Crisis book, checks and balance parenting. Both the mother's perspective on why the tree should not be climbed to the very highest level, because maybe the child could fall out of that tree, hit the sidewalk, and get a concussion, and that's the end of the child. And yet at the same time, fathers knowing enough about the data to know that when a child climbs a tree and takes risks going from branch to branch, figuring out which branch is safe and which branch isn't, that its psychomotor functioning increases and its IQ increases. I've never heard a dad say, I want my child to climb a tree because his IQ or her IQ will increase. Dads have to know part of what our larger picture story is we men have to educate ourselves. We men have to not go off and go, men go their own way, but take that energy and be leaders in challenging the shadow side of feminism, but also not assuming its worst intent, because the average woman just knows what has been told to her, just like the average person knows what has been told to her. She hasn't thought this through because she's spending her life doing other things that like raising children and doing work. And so we have to be the leader. Instead of running our own way, we have to be the leaders in challenging this. We have to remember that when men's groups and strikes and protests that fathers do are formed, usually, I remember this fellow in Washington, D.C., putting hundreds of thousands of dollars, that he was a wealthy person, to bring together a large group of fathers in Washington to protest what was happening to fathers around equal shared parenting. And about 40 people showed up. When women put out, a very fast notice, they get huge numbers to show up. And so we have to say, we love you, and there's an alternative way of looking at this world than just through hashtag Me Too. Hashtag Me Too needs not to be a monologue. It needs to be hashtag Me Too dialogue. Both sexes have to hear each other.
But feminism does not listen to men. I mean, not hardly at all. I want to throw this out here. I heard this, I don't remember when, where, or whether I thought it myself. I don't know. It wasn't my thought. I heard it somewhere, and it just kind of made sense to me. That in many ways, feminism is the dark side of female nature. I mean, when you look at the overarching pressure and direction of feminist thinking, if you will, it's filled with hatred, filled with anger, filled with envy of men, and they celebrate their anger and hatred and violent tendencies towards men. That leads me to believe that really, in a larger kind of global, holistic sense, feminism is the dark side of female nature. It attracts those women who are prone to give in to their own dark side. What do you think about that, Warren?
Yeah, I think I would say more that I would just modify that slightly, or maybe significantly, to say that the great majority of women who initially identified as feminists wanted and focused on opportunities for themselves in the workplace that they did not have before, and identifying ways that they felt hurt or discriminated against. However, in recent years, especially the last 4 or 5 years, feminism's toxicity has been very, very powerful. As I said before, we've gone from I am woman, I am strong, to I am woman, I've been wrong. And the emphasis on honing victimhood as a fine art has become very apparent. The truth is that any ideology that goes unquestioned starts getting more and more rigid on that, and more toxic, and its shadow side shows more and more. And feminism has not only become unquestioned to a large degree, it has become bureaucratized. But we also have to remember that, and Democrats have to hear that if you don't like Trump was elected to a significant degree because feminism has been so successful in its institutionalization of things like human resources, and its belief that men earn more money for the same work, and its belief that men batter women. And many families and men know that isn't an accurate portrayal of the world. And so that somebody like Trump, personality-wise and all, was able to come in and appear and be successful. When the price is high enough, the prostitute will appear. And so if you're a Democrat who doesn't like Trump, look inside of yourself and look at the mirror and see the atmosphere that you have created that has made a person like Trump so appealing at this point in history.
I agree with that. That's the thing that feminists should have a look at, is what is their role in contributing to the problem. But I don't see any indication that there's a significant movement in that direction, or even a will to think about it in the feminist movement.
I would agree with you, and so that's why I am encouraging people who are in bureaucracies that are being paid to explain patriarchy in the way that we talked about before, are, as Al Gore said about global warming, you cannot expect people who are paid to believe the opposite to to change their course when it will undermine what they're paid for. And so, so which is why I'd say that we have to speak up and take responsibility, and to get the sexes to talk with each other. And that's why I'm trying to create, on the one hand, a couples communication Zoom course that can be available to everybody in every community, so that people can begin the process that I think, what we are begging for is knowing how to hear each other, knowing how to listen to each other, knowing how to have a respectful dialogue where you and I agree on some things and disagree on the other, but can still work with each other and hear each other out. That's the modeling we have to be setting for the world. And we have to call upon men to show up in large numbers, and the women who agree with and empathize and feel that their own view. I've talked to many women who have said, I read your book and I brought it up in a women's group, or I brought it up at a meeting, and I was looked at like daggers were going through me. So it is not only men who are afraid to speak about men's issues, it is women that are also afraid to speak about men's issues and boys' issues. Because remember, biologically, we are programmed to protect women and to be willing to have men be disposable. That's the evolutionary heritage that we are all fighting. That's why I have so much patience. I don't expect things to change overnight, because when women spoke up, we are biologically programmed to compete with each other to protect women and to give them what they say. Women are not biologically programmed to do that with men, but women are biologically programmed to do that with boys. And that's why framing things through boys is far more likely to be successful. And that's one of the reasons I wrote The Boy Crisis, because I can communicate many things with a stimulation of much greater empathy. And now I have to get off because my house is being repaired, and I've asked all the workers to go on a work break while we did the show together. But it's more than an hour, and so they are wanting to get paid rather than eat. And so,
okay, great. So, Warren, we're back at the end of next month. Is that good for you?
Absolutely.
For our next session?
Yes.
Shall we pick the same Thursday time frame?
Let me see. Do you have a calendar?
We'll do this offline. I'll just end the broadcast for now, and you and I will get. I just wanted to get that confirmed there, so the audience knows that we're going to be doing this on a monthly basis to update from Warren Farrell and his opinions on what's going on in the ongoing war of the sexes and more.
You may agree with me or disagree with me, but I'll always be honest with you.
Excellent. That's all I can ask and all I can hope for. Thank you so much, Warren. And thank you thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And tomorrow, Janice Fiamengo's on. So don't miss us tomorrow afternoon with Janice Fiamengo on Coffee with Steve, and Warren will be on again in a month's time. And next week, I haven't announced this yet, but Aaron Pizzey is on I think it's Tuesday. So stay tuned to Studio Brule. Lots of great programming in the works.
Two extraordinary women.
Definitely.